Okay, so I had to redo this page, page 7 of the Janome Mb4, Mb4s, and Mb7 screen. I believe the Mb7 is the same software. I'm not totally sure on that. But I had to redo this screen because I revisited it as I'm doing like quilting in the hoop with my machine. I started a series on that, and I realized that my original video, one part of it was incorrect, and that was this page when I got down here. And I think I'm correct this time that these two items here, or choices or what have you, those have to do with a tie-on. So it's like, do you want your machine, do you want this machine to stitch a tie on after a color change? Do you want your machine to stitch a tie on after a thread trimming? And if you think about it, that's what a tie-on is. It's whatever is going to happen after a color change. So if I'm stitching a red object, and remember, these machines always trim when a color is all done, because that's a color stop and the machine trims. Well, after it does that trim, after it changes that color, do I want it to make a locking stitch on the next object? You know, on the next color or whatever. And if you take your arrow button here and scroll down and click on, then you're saying yes, make a locking stitch or a tie on when you're done with the color that I'm working on. You know, the next color, make a tie on. And it makes about, I tried to count it, it makes about 4 or 5 stitches. So it's a pretty good tie on. So, and I find that helpful because a lot of digitizers, especially if you're buying fonts that are satin stitched, a lot of digitizers don't put a good enough tie on the satin letter because they figure, oh, well, you're just going to be stitching over it, that the knot's not going to come out. But if it's a really thin letter, that may unravel. So you may want to have this checked. So this is after a color change. So let me just put that off now. This one here is, do you want a locking stitch after a thread trimming within the same color? I wish they would have put that wording in here. So if you're in the same color and you want a tie on after you trimmed the thread, so you're stitching along with beige thread, and you come to a part of the design where it has to jump over to another part of this design, still with beige thread. And you're going to have it trim the first part. Well, if you're going to have it trim the first part, you better go to the next page and have this checked, jump thread trimming, because that's basically what a jump thread is. A jump thread is when you're stitching a color, say beige again, and you're done with this part of the design with beige, but you have to jump over to another part of the design and do the beige. Well, that's a jump. Well, you probably put a tie off in your digitizing software. You probably, have a tie off there. And you may or may not, I don't know, but you should if it's a jump. So anyways, if you want it to lock stitch after thread trimming, then you have to tell it to do thread trimming on the jumps, because remember, this is within the same color, and a jump is referring to you're working in the same color. So you have to have that checked. I'll go back. And so if you're going to trim jumps, after that part of the design ties off, we're going to assume it has a tie off, and it trims, then it's going to jump over to the new part of the design. Do we want to put a locking stitch or tie on in that new part of the design? And if you do, because you're not sure if the digitizer put one in or you digitized it and you just want to make sure that there's an extra one in, maybe you already have one in and you want to put in another one, you can click this. So you take this arrow key here and go down and click on right there, and then you'd have that. And then you'd make sure, like I said, that this was on. And I think I went through this screen in the other video, but if you do have jump thread trimming on, this next part says, okay, well, when do you want to start trimming jumps? Because some people don't like to start trimming their jump threads right away. Sometimes they make 2 stitches off to the side and then jump over to the real part of the design to make a nice clean tie on. So they would want it to stitch, or they would want it to trim the jump not on the first jump, not on that first one that jumps over to the design, but maybe on, let me go down, and plus, maybe on the second jump. So then maybe, you know, once it's in the design and that, maybe you want it to trim. And remember, jumps are generally within the same color. Now, my digitizing software, Mbird, it's weird because a lot of times it'll say there's a color stop and then there's a jump. And it's not really a jump within a color. It's kind of like, I don't know why they put that in there, because you've got the color stop. So I think that's why people get confused. And then I know I went over this minimum jump thread length to cut. Mine, I have everything off and everything because I don't have that checked. But let's just say I did. Let's just leave it at 2. Normally, like anything longer than like, or I should say shorter, anything shorter than like 5 mils. 5 mils, well, 6 mils is 1/4 of an inch. About 12 mils is about a 1/2 inch. I mean, honestly, it's hard to bury that much, you know, that small of a length on your own, but maybe you could grab it with a tweezer and cut it. So maybe you'd want it to say, like, come over here. Whoops. It's on there. You got to go. Okay, 1 3/16, that's an inch. That's the longest you can leave it at. So in other words, if a jump is longer than 1 3/16, I want this machine to cut it. Some people are doing font that has tie-ons and tie-offs, and they want it to not. Why am I in inches? I thought I was in mils. Let me go back. Sorry. Okay, here, mils. I just want to be in mils for that part of it. Okay, mils. Okay. Okay. So a lot of people say, well, I don't want my machine to cut my jump threads unless it's 2 mils or more, unless that jump thread is 2 millimeters or more. And to be honest, I don't think that that would mean, that would tell me then, oh, so you mean you're going to just leave them in there and not cut them? Well, 2 mils is big. And so, okay, 1 mil, then cut them. So anything 1 mil or longer, I want it to cut. Otherwise, leave it. Those you may not see those. But 2 mils, you're telling the machine you're going to leave 2 mils there so everybody could see that. I normally digitize like my fonts so that there's no tie-ons or tie-offs between them. They're close enough together that I just put a tiny stitch in between and I sink a stitch. There might be like 1 mil or 1.5 mil stitch length, and then a needle penetration right in the center, and then another stitch length over, about 1 or 1.5 mils. So that's how I digitize my letters. Sometimes they completely touch, but when I do it that way, I don't have tie-ons or tie-offs. It just sews. They're just called connections. They're not, they're not even called jumps. So I don't really use this at all because of the way I digitize. But if you buy, say, font, as a stitch file, they have a tie-on and a tie-off. And so between your letters, you have a choice if you want to have the machine cut it or you want to cut it. And like I said, it depends on how close you put them and what have you. So this can be so confusing, to be honest. I have mine off. So when this is off, none of these even matter. Now this down here I have turned on because that allows you to use the jog buttons even while you're sewing. And I tried it with it on and off, and I was able to jog my design even while I was sewing, even when this was checked off. So I'm not sure about that. So, but the biggest thing is these two are tie-ons. Originally in my first video, I thought that this was just the tie-on and this was the tie-off. That's incorrect. They're both referring to tie-on. So they're calling a locking stitch here a tie-on in this case. I would just, let me turn it off, because right now I have everything turned off because I'm doing quilting in the hoop. And if you want to experiment with this, what you'd want to do, whoops, off. Let me say okay. You want to bring up a crosshair, say in a basting box that has no tie-ons on it, no tie-offs or anything, and then go through them and see, if the machine ties on or ties off. So right now I have nothing selected. So go back. So there's no tie-ons, and there's no jump thread trimming or anything. So if I go through this cross here, and I'm going to just go through part of it. So I'm going to take my fast forward button. I'm going to click this button here to see what's stitching first. Oh, the basting box is stitching first. If you want to flip those, to be honest, this is the trick you do. I don't know how this got in here, but you hit menu in the edit screen, and you just have to touch the basting box if I want that to stitch last. So it's almost like the last thing you touch, that's what'll stitch last. And then you hit OK. And see now the basting box, if I hit this, the first object is the crosshair. That is just so wild. I can't even believe that that happens. So anyways, so if you want to see what is stitching, you hit this button. So the crosshair is stitching first. I'm going to fast forward, use this button and fast forward through this design, and I'll just show you down here. And I know this is a rough video because I have so many more I have to edit, so sorry about that, but I wanted to get this in here. So I'm going to fast forward through that crosshair and until it right before it jumps over. Now remember, these have no tie-ons or tie-offs in them. So let me fast forward. It's on needle number 1, so it's starting up at the top. I could go like this just to, so we know what's going on. And then here, I don't even have a tie-off at the bottom of this crosshair. After this, it jumps over to this horizontal part of the crosshair. So before it gets down to the bottom, let me reverse, and I'll just start stitching there. Okay. Just was okay, so we're within the same color, and let's see. I have to decide which one I want to simulate. So if I go into settings and I go back to 3 to this page, and if I want to simulate one of these, well, my next thing is going to be a color change, so I might as well simulate this one. So if I want a locking stitch after the color change, because after my crosshair, then a basting box is going to stitch, and it's going to be a different color. If I want that new basting box to have a tie on, I turn this on. So I scroll down with these arrows, then I hit on. So it should do a locking stitch for the basting box. Locking stitch after color change. And remember, this machine always trims after a color change, but we're not talking about that now. So just so you know, I know that gets so confusing. Okay, so I'm just going to let it stitch. I'm going to just hit OK here. And it's still on stitch 54. It's just going to continue on. And it's going to end here. There's no tie off here. So it should just stitch, trim. Now remember, for it to trim, it actually has to take one extra stitch to trim. So currently there is no tie-offs at the end of this color, but I want to see how many the machine makes because it does have to do a trim. And it is possible that the machine says to itself, well, hey lady, if you know, I have to trim this. It's a color change. If I'm going to trim a color change, I have to make a knot. I have to make a tie off. So just so you know. And then we're going to see when it goes to the next color for the basting box, which I think starts up at the top, we're going to see if it does do a tie-on because I had that checked to do a locking stitch after a color change. So I'll hit the start button to continue on. See, it did 1, 2. It did 2 tie, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it went. So that's the tie-on. So it is just like one back stitch for it to do a trim. It's a back stitch. It comes to the end, it goes back, and then forward. So it's basically 2 stitches for the trim on the color change. It has to. I mean, it's the trimmer has to have something hard to push against, something tight. There has to be a knot there for it to trim. It can't just trim something loose and then all this starts unraveling. So I can understand that. And then here, it did do like 5 or 6 locking stitches. So that was pretty good. That's pretty tight. So that was a locking stitch after a color change. So now let's do the other scenario. Let's go back to setting. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Oh, okay. So we're going to go down. We're going to turn that one off because we only want to do one at a time. Now this one, we're going to do this scenario, locking stitch after thread trimming. Remember, this scenario this is still for a tie-on because it's a locking stitch. But what if we're in the same color and we trim and go to another part of the design? Do you still want us to do a locking stitch or a tie-on when we get to that second part of the design? And I'll say yes, I do. So to simulate this, I have to go back to my crosshair and the vertical part. Remember, on this one, I have to tell it to trim a jump if you're going to use it, because we're within the same color, so we have to go to the next page and tell it to trim jumps, because otherwise it's not going to trim. And so now that we are trimming up, but I want to trim it on the first jump, so I have to go down because I only have one jump in this design. Okay, and then minimum jump thread length to cut. Well, this just means anything more than 2 mils I want you to cut. Okay, so this has to be checked if you want it to tie on after a thread trimming, because you won't get a thread trimming unless you check thread trimming. So we'll go back and remember, when it trims within my color, it seems like it's making a knot, but it's really only like a back stitch, and you'll see that here. So I'm not going to take these threads out. I'm not going to bother taking them out. We're just going to go over the same one. So anyways, so that's checked. Lock stitch after thread trimming, which means we want it to make a tie-on when we go to this part of the crosshair. So it stitches the vertical. I want it to trim this. I don't want this jump here. I want it to trim this jump. And then when it goes over here, I want it to make a tie-on. Because remember, this design has no tie-ons or tie-offs digitized in it. So I'm just going to leave that, and hopefully we can count in that. So I'm going to, again, use my thread. I'll say, okay, I got that checked, got the next page checked. And I'm going to use my thread spool to simulate reopening the design. And I'm just going to hit it a couple times and one more. So I'm at the beginning of my design, and I'm just going to fast forward through it again with this to get down low, like, to get about here, because that's really where we want to concentrate on. So I'm hitting my fast forward. I'm just going to push this down again. And this thread is probably going to come undone. I don't know, but I'm going to pull my tension lever back and put this up here. Pull it forward. Okay, so I'll just start there, and I'll press the start button. Now remember, we wanted to trim here and tie on there. And the trim is going to probably just look like one little back stitch. See, it went 1, 2 in the same spot basically. I don't even 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it goes. So it did the tie on within the color change like I wanted. This one here, I guess it didn't do a back stitch. Maybe it did. Oh yeah, it did, because I don't know for sure. This thread might have just come out. But whether it did a back stitch, it looked like it did one up here. I'm thinking maybe they don't do a full back stitch, because when you do a tie, you go backwards, but you go just a minuscule amount because, you know, you don't want it to unravel. And a lot of people who have old vintage sewing machines, if that don't have a backwards movement, you know, going back stitching, a lot of times they just make their stitch length smaller and go like 5 stitches, and then that'll never come out. So that's basically, I think, what this did. It looked like it went in the same spot, but it didn't. And I probably saw it go backwards over here because it's horizontal. So, but yeah, it's a lot to take in with that setting screen, a lot. So I'm really glad I updated the video. I hope this helps somebody. So, all right, well, let me go back to the setting screen because I'm doing quilting in the hoop right now, and I am not doing any trimming or nothing. I'm burying my threads. Let me go down, turn that off. All right then. And the other thing is, if you need any help, you can always write me on Facebook, Lisa We Quilt. And I do have some how-to videos and whatnot on my YouTube channel, We Quilt Studio. I have Mb4 and Skype tutorial lessons on my website. I have Mb4 tutorials that are already done on my website. So, you know, I'm always there to help out, and I know this is hard, especially when the software is you know, doesn't really spell things out. It's hard to know what they really mean. So these here are for tie-ons. Okay, thanks.